New investigative reporting has uncovered additional proof of corruption and financial misconduct from conservative Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, connected to his good friend, the billionaire Nazi memorabilia collector Harlan Crow. Intrigued? Then click that like and subscribe and enjoy the video. So for the past several weeks, the media and political commentators have been discussing the recently uncovered evidence of financial misconduct, ethical violations, and corruption surrounding Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, one of the 6 regressively conservative Supreme Court supermajority. It was connected to a patron of sorts, and a guy named Harlan Crow, who sounds like, I mentioned this in a previous video, that name sounds so much like a villain in one of the seasons of Justified, which was a really good show on FX a couple of years back. But anyway, what was initially discovered was that Harlan Crow, over the span of decades, was apparently taking Clarence Thomas and his wife on these elaborate trips and yacht excursions and trips to the Adirondacks and things like that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like the value of these trips and these perks and these privileges, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Justice Thomas never disclosed any of this, despite the fact that most career ethicists were saying, yeah, this should have been disclosed, absolutely. See, the thing is, every judge in this country is obligated to disclose their finances, particularly at the federal level, in order to avoid any evidence of impropriety. The whole point of the federal judiciary, in theory, is that they're apolitical, and all of their judgments in court cases are objective and impartial, regardless of what their political ideology is, regardless of how, what their personal values are, that they look at the facts and they decide coldly on the facts, even if the facts contradict their personal values and ideology. That's the theory. So the idea is you don't want judges to be bribed or susceptible to financial pressure from potential future litigants. You certainly don't want that at the Supreme Court level, since they interpret, ultimately, the Constitution, and they settle matters of constitutionality. They can overturn, again in theory, congressional laws. That's a lot of power, especially when those 9 justices are appointed for life. They're not under review to keep their jobs. Once they sit on that bench, they're there for life until they choose to resign. The problem is, though the Supreme Court says that they will comply with these ethical rules, they are not legally obligated to. There's no enforcement mechanism if a Supreme Court judge decides, well, I just don't want to disclose getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars effectively in the form of elaborate trips and perks and privileges and gifts by my conservative billionaire friend, who also happens to be a Nazi memorabilia collector. That was the other weird thing. Harlan Crow, Clarence Thomas's good buddy of several decades, this dude collects Nazi memorabilia, Nazi napkins, and Nazi items, Nazi artifacts. As a matter of fact, he has a signed copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf on display in his house. It's really weird. Really weird. And it's been funny to see conservatives bend over backwards to try to justify why you would collect Nazi memorabilia and display it in your house. Well, like Ben Shapiro, of all people, was like, well, okay, gang. So here's the thing. So it's not really out of bounds or out of question. I mean, my God, you could collect things to remind you of what you hate. I don't like Ben Shapiro. Wouldn't say I hate him. I don't like him, but I don't collect his stuff and get his autograph and display it everywhere. Why do you need to be reminded of what you don't like or what you hate or what you oppose? Why do you need to put that on display? And certainly something like Nazi artifacts. And so anyway, that was the initial reporting. And then it's come out additional reporting since then. We apparently, Harlan Crow bought Justice Clarence Thomas's mother's house and let her stay in it, essentially paid for her shelter. And that wasn't disclosed. But then we found out today that there's more, like in the words of the late, great Billy Mays. But wait, there's more. Remember Billy Mays? Well, there's more people. So it turns out that, according to, again, additional investigation from ProPublica, Clarence Thomas had adopted, he became the legal guardian of his grandnephew, not his great-grandnephew, his grandnephew, decades ago. The guy's in his 30s now. and he's essentially raised him as a son. Okay, which actually that's really nice that he would do that. It's always good to have a good legal guardian, and to take care of people that you don't think are being taken care of by their own. But yeah, he was raising him as a son, and apparently the private schools that Clarence Thomas's grandnephew went to, the tuition in these elite private schools, at least 2 years of them, or at least a year in one and a year in another, so 2 years total, were also paid by this Nazi memorabilia collector billionaire friend, Harlan Crow, and Thomas never disclosed that information. So Clarence Thomas has a surrogate son, somebody that he adopted, his grandnephew, and 2 years worth of private school education, totaling in 6 figures, was paid for by a third party, this conservative Nazi memorabilia collector billionaire, Harlan Crow, and it was never disclosed. Never. Again, ethicists, as the article reports, they agreed that this is ridiculous, including retired federal judges. You can't be having secret financial arrangements, says Mark W. Bennett, a retired federal judge appointed by President Bill Clinton. Bennett said he was friendly with Thomas and declined to comment for the record about the specific of Thomas's actions, or the specifics, rather. But yeah, you can't have secret financial arrangements. So yes, even career ethicists, as this article points out, say that this should have been disclosed. The fact that it wasn't, the fact that Harlan Crow paid for Clarence Thomas's mother's house, also 6 figures, and the fact that he had 6 figures worth of luxurious trips and gifts over the years, this is clearly establishing a fact pattern. Clarence Thomas doesn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. He has clearly failed again and again and again and again to disclose large sums of financial gifts and perks from a right-wing, conservative, politically activist billionaire, who again also collects Nazi memorabilia. This is unacceptable. If the shoe was on the other foot, if a liberal judge had done this, and by the way, perhaps there is evidence out there, perhaps one of the liberal judges on the bench, or one of the previous liberal judges on the bench who are no longer sitting because they passed or retired, perhaps they have also failed in a meaningful way to disclose substantial gifts. That's unacceptable too. But no evidence of anything like this has been presented. This is uniquely bad. And this is proof that the Supreme Court needs ethical enforcement. There's a Latin phrase that I see Democrats like Sheldon Whitehouse, who I really like, he's used before, but essentially it's the idea that no man can be his own judge in his own case, right? Everybody needs oversight. That's a principle of the Constitution. Congress, there's this notion of checks and balances, but also separation of powers. There are checks and balances that each branch is supposed to have on the other to keep them in check. Presidential action has congressional oversight. The president can interfere in congressional action, but the Supreme Court, it's interesting. It's like they are a class unto themselves. Lifetime appointments, they never have to be reelected or reaffirmed, and they're apparently not legally obligated or beholden to the same ethical standards. They should be, and we know, obviously, like the highest court in the land should not be allowed to operate at the lowest ethical standards. If anything, they should have higher ethical standards. Like, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So if they have the most power in the judiciary, you could easily make the argument that not only should they operate at the ethical baseline of every other judge and every other court, they should even operate higher. And you shouldn't get a choice. It shouldn't be discretionary. It should be mandatory. So Democrats are attempting to propose legislation that would do that. Obviously, because right now the current bent of the Supreme Court favors Republicans and conservatives, Republicans are opposing it. But this is proof that Clarence Thomas is corrupt. I mean, we've known it for some time because of this investigative reporting for how he didn't recuse himself from a Supreme Court case involving his own wife's attempt to overthrow the government with January 6th. This man is uniquely corrupt. But the Supreme Court as an institution needs to be put in check. They should be obligated to behave at the highest ethical standards. And hopefully, this reporting and the backlash that the Supreme Court is getting will compel them to do just that.